The leaders of the group of developing nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, agreed to expand the group and granted membership to 6 more countries.
Minutes ago, the countries Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, collectively known as BRICS, shocked everyone by deciding to stop using the US dollar and start trading with their own money instead. These countries, home to almost half the world's people, are challenging the big Western countries that usually control the global money system. Tune in as we uncover how this big change could turn the world's money system upside down. BRICS expands its influence and membership. The influence of this group now goes beyond just economic matters. They are also focused on geopolitical and technological issues, trying to reduce the control of the US and its allies over the global financial system. This group, which was formed over 10 years ago, initially came together to challenge what they saw as unfair control by Western countries, especially the US and Europe, over world affairs. As the meeting ended, rumors of a secret deal hinted at a major shakeup coming soon. During the 15th summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, leaders from the member nations, along with representatives from 67 other countries, attended. This high level of participation showed just how important this group is becoming on the global stage, highlighting its growing impact on international relations and systems. If Saudi Arabia officially joins, it could have a huge impact on the global financial system. Since 1974, Saudi Arabia has been part of the petrodollar system, which has supported the US dollar as the world's main currency for trade, especially in oil. A move away from this could lead to a surplus of US dollars in global markets, which might cause inflation, especially in the US. But that's not the whole story. Egypt, which has received US aid since 1978, is also changing its international partnerships by joining. This could change trade routes and economic connections in Africa, showing that Egypt wants to broaden its international ties and rely less on Western countries. Likewise, the UAE, a longtime partner of the US, has begun to shift its alliances by engaging more with Chinese technologies and joining, indicating a strategic move to diversify its relationships. Iran's inclusion, while less surprising due to its difficult relations with Western countries, adds important economic strength. Iran's large oil and gas reserves give additional economic power, which supports the group's efforts to increase its influence in global economics and politics. Iran's advanced ability to make military equipment, like drones, brings a new level of importance to its role in the group. On the other hand, Ethiopia, the second most populated country in Africa, has received significant aid from the United States, about $3 billion since 2020. However, in 2021, things got tense when Ethiopia said the US was getting too involved in its internal matters, particularly around human rights. By joining, Ethiopia is making a big shift in who it partners with globally, and this decision might influence how other African nations think about their own international relationships. The addition of big oil producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE has also made the group much stronger economically. Together, these countries now control over half of the world's oil production. Their economies are worth about $4 trillion combined, which makes up 35% of the world's economy. This gives a lot of power, positioning it as a strong group that can stand against Western-led economic systems. For instance, this group has created its own payment system called Pay. This platform connects national payment systems and provides a new way of sending financial messages, serving as an alternative to the traditional SWIFT system. They also established the New Development Bank, which helps support economic recovery, like after the pandemic, and promotes the use of local currencies for international trade to reduce reliance on the US dollar. China and India are also working on improving their payment systems to make it easier to trade within this group without depending on Western financial networks. This strategy challenges the US dollar's position as the main global currency and gives countries under the US. But this wasn't just about money. For Russia, it's also a political move. Russia wants to reduce its exposure to US economic policies and sanctions, which it sees as tools the US uses to push its own global agenda. This effort is even more important now as relations between Russia, the US, and Europe have been strained since 2014. Under heavy sanctions, Russia leads a new financial strategy within BRICS. Russia's push for a swift alternative amid sanctions. When Russia took control of Crimea from Ukraine, a series of tough punishments followed. These punishments included freezing financial assets and stopping transactions with Russia. In 2018, after a poisoning incident in Salisbury, even more countries joined in with penalties against Russia. One reason for this is that Russia has been moving away from using the US dollar for its transactions. In recent years, Russia reduced its dependence on the dollar to 50%, and the Russian ruble now makes up about 14% of its transactions. Russia has also been looking for other options, such as proposing a new system to compete with SWIFT, which is widely used for international money transfers. It has even encouraged other member countries to adopt this new system. This effort could inspire other countries to follow suit and create their own systems or join. If more countries do this, it could reduce the power of the US dollar globally, leading to a more divided financial world. Historically, currencies that dominate global finance have lasted about 100 years. The US dollar became the main currency in 1944 after the Bretton Woods Agreement, though some argue it happened even earlier, around the 1920s. Well-known investor Stanley Druckenmiller believes that the US dollar could lose its status as the world's top currency within the next 15 years because of the country's current economic policies. But this isn't the only concern. The decline of the Roman Empire was partly due to similar economic problems. Roman leaders reduced the amount of silver in their coins to create more money, which led to inflation and economic instability. This is somewhat similar to modern-day money printing. Ancient Roman statesman Cicero advised maintaining a balanced budget and controlling public debt, lessons that still apply today. The US, however, continues to spend heavily overseas. It operates over 750 military bases worldwide and spends more on its military than the next 10 biggest countries combined, in addition to providing a lot of foreign aid. As the US dollar's role fades, alternative currencies and assets like gold are becoming more popular. In 2022, central banks bought a record amount of gold, the most since 1950, as a way to protect themselves against inflation and economic uncertainty. In the first few months of 2023, central banks bought 228 tons of gold, which was 34% higher than the previous record. This group is also pushing for reforms at major global financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, while promoting their own institutions, such as the New Development Bank. This bank, which started in 2017, has funded projects like electric buses in Brazil, a hydropower plant in Russia, and water supply projects in India. It provides financing without the strict conditions that the IMF and the World Bank often impose, making it more attractive to developing countries, especially in Africa. Additionally, the bank supports the use of member countries' own national currencies in trade and investment, encouraging the growth of a local currency market. As this group continues to grow in global economic influence, it could lead to increased competition between the US and China, especially in regions like Latin America and Africa. With this group expanding and strengthening its trade ties, the US may see its influence in these regions decline. This shift challenges the traditional dominance of Western countries in global economic institutions and raises important questions about the future of the world's financial order, especially as geopolitical tensions grow and globalization faces more resistance. The US and Europe are turning more of their focus toward the East, especially building stronger ties with China, Russia, and important countries in the Middle East. This shift shows that Egypt is taking a practical approach to the changing world order. Cairo is aiming to grow its economic and political partnerships as the global balance of power changes. Egypt and China have developed a strong partnership, largely because of shared economic and strategic benefits. Egypt has become an important part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, a global trade plan thanks to the Suez Canal, which is a key point in China's maritime routes. Chinese investment in Egypt has grown a lot, particularly in areas like infrastructure, manufacturing, and energy. One example of this is the Suez Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone, where many Chinese companies have set up operations. This shows China's commitment to helping Egypt grow its industrial capabilities. In fact, China is now the biggest investor in the Suez Canal Economic Zone, and they are playing a big role in the construction of Egypt's new administrative capital, a massive project that represents Egypt's vision for modern growth. One of the reasons Egypt is leaning toward China is because China focuses on economic cooperation without getting involved in military matters. unlike the US, which tends to use military power. This makes China an attractive partner for Egypt. In 2022, trade between the two countries reached about $13 billion, and China has helped create jobs in Egypt and boosted the country's manufacturing power through large projects. But China is not Egypt's only partner in the East. Egypt has also been strengthening its ties with Russia. The two countries have a long history of working together, dating back to the Soviet era. But now their partnership goes beyond just military cooperation. They are working together in areas like nuclear energy and industrial development. One key project is the Russian industrial zone in Port Said, which is set to upgrade Egypt's industrial capacity. Russia is also critical to Egypt's food security, supplying 70% of the wheat Egypt imports, which is vital since Egypt is one of the largest wheat importers in the world. The two countries are also collaborating on a grain logistics center in Damietta to further deepen their economic ties. As this group grows and challenges the West, it steps into a new role on the world stage. Egypt and others challenge Western dominance in global governance. Egypt joined this group on January 1, 2024, which marks a big step in its plan to be part of a multipolar world. This shows Egypt's intention to broaden its economic partnerships and rely less on Western-dominated institutions. By joining, Egypt is aligning itself with major emerging powers like China, Russia, and India, signaling its intent to play an active role in the global economic landscape. This group, which now includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and soon Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE, argues that the current global governance system is outdated. They believe it doesn't give emerging economies a fair say in decision-making. This dissatisfaction has led to push for changes at international institutions like the United Nations. The group represents over 45% of the world's population and almost 35% of global GDP. They argue that the UN, especially its Security Council, is too heavily influenced by Western countries. At the moment, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the US, UK, France, Russia, and China, have veto power. This group's nations say this doesn't reflect the way global power is distributed today. But that's not the only issue. 54 African countries, which account for nearly 28% of the UN's membership, don't have permanent representation on the Security Council. This lack of representation for a significant part of the world's population has been a point of contention for years. Critics also argue that Western nations control too much of the voting power in key financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, making it harder for emerging economies to have a fair say. India and Brazil have been pushing for the Security Council to be expanded, allowing large developing nations to have permanent seats. While this idea has gained some traction, it faces a lot of resistance from Western powers. This group's countries often criticize international organizations like the UN for showing favoritism toward Western nations, especially when it comes to issues like human rights. For instance, Russia and China, both members, often face criticism for their domestic policies. Russia has been scrutinized for its treatment of LGBTQ+ individuals, while China faces criticism for its actions in regions like Tibet and Xinjiang. However, they argue that similar issues in Western countries don't receive the same level of global attention. For example, while Russia is regularly condemned for human rights abuses, problems in Western countries such as racial profiling or the mistreatment of indigenous populations often get less global condemnation. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The Israel-Palestine conflict exposes these inconsistencies even further. While international outrage was quick after Hamas's attacks on Israeli civilians, the response to Israel's countermeasures, such as using white phosphorus and blocking essential supplies in Gaza, has been more restrained. This uneven response adds fuel to this group's country's argument that the current global system is biased. Groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have criticized these actions, calling them potential violations of the laws of war. But what's more surprising is how weak the response has been from the broader international community. This brings up a common issue: the unequal ways humanitarian efforts are handled around the world. A good example of this imbalance can be seen in how Europe has treated refugees. For instance, when refugees from Ukraine started arriving, the European Union quickly offered them help. Ukrainian refugees were given the right to work, access to education, and healthcare. However, this was a very different response compared to how Europe handled the refugee crisis in 2015. Back then, many countries built walls and tightened their asylum rules, especially for people fleeing war zones in Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. They often claimed it was for safety reasons. As a result, refugees from these regions are now struggling in overcrowded camps in countries like Turkey and Lebanon. This clear difference in treatment has led many to argue that race and religion play a major role in how refugees are received. Since most Ukrainian refugees are white and Christian, they are seen as culturally closer to Europeans, and this may explain the more welcoming approach. But this wasn't the worst part. On a broader scale, there's also a global struggle for influence that affects emerging nations. Countries like China and India feel that they don't have enough say in major global institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations. These organizations were created after World War II, at a time when the United States and Europe held much of the power. Today, though, the global economy has shifted. China has become the second largest economy, and India has overtaken China in terms of population. Yet these shifts are not reflected in how these global organizations operate. For example, the IMF is still led by a European and the World Bank by an American. This frustrates countries in this group: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which together make up about 35% of the world's GDP. Despite this, they only have around 15% of the voting power in the IMF. China, with an economy worth $18 trillion, holds less than 7% of the votes. These countries have been calling for changes to the voting rules, but so far the progress has been slow and mostly symbolic. The decision by this group to add new members, such as Egypt, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia, has caught the attention of many, especially in the West. This move signals a shift in global politics, raising questions about the future of organizations like the United Nations. This group's expansion isn't just for show, it's a clear effort to create alternatives to the existing international systems. One such alternative is the New Development Bank, which this group started in 2014 with $50 billion to support infrastructure projects in developing countries. Unlike Western institutions, this bank doesn't impose strict conditions on loans. Additionally, this group's members are discussing the idea of creating a new currency to challenge the dominance of the US dollar in international trade. While this plan is still in the early stages, it could significantly change how the global economy works. And that's not all. Political tensions between this group's members and the West are growing. Russia, for instance, has become more isolated due to sanctions after its invasion of Ukraine. In response, Russia has strengthened its ties within. China, too, faces ongoing disagreements with the West over issues in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and the South China Sea. These tensions have only made this group more determined to push for changes in global institutions, which they believe are biased against them. Sanctions on Russian businesses have also disrupted global energy markets, hurting developing countries that rely on Russian resources. At the same time, the IMF's slow pace in adjusting voting power continues to create frustration. China, with its $14 trillion economy in 2020, is still underrepresented in the IMF's decision-making process. This delay in reform is seen by many emerging nations as further proof that the gap between wealthy and developing countries is widening. But here's the catch: as this group expands and its economic power grows, the balance could start to shift. If changes in established institutions remain out of reach, this group could continue building its own alternatives, which might eventually reduce the influence of the Western-led global order. Just 3 years after forming an alliance, Turkey's strategic location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia became critical during the Cold War, helping to hold back Soviet power. For a long time, being part of NATO was a central part of Turkey's defense plan, giving it a place in the world's strongest military alliance. However, Turkey's efforts to build a closer relationship with Western countries, especially the European Union, have been much more difficult. Although Turkey was named a candidate for EU membership in 1999 and began formal talks in 2005, the process has moved very slowly. By 2024, Turkey had only managed to discuss 16 out of the 35 required areas membership, and only one of these was almost finished. Since 2019, negotiations have mostly stalled, showing a growing gap between Ankara and Brussels. Will a shift in global economic power lead to a more balanced world order? Or are we heading towards greater global instability? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more insights.